It's been organised by Socialist Alliance and Resistance, and my name's Sue Bolton. I'm stepping in on behalf of someone who had a last-minute family medical emergency. So I'd like to begin, before I begin the forum, I'd like to recognise that where I'm sitting at the moment, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung in the city of Melbourne, which is also known as Naarm. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was stolen and never ceded, and the struggle for justice for First Nations people in Australia is ongoing, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. This is a really important discussion. We've organised this meeting in response to the escalation of rhetoric against China and anti-Asian racism drummed up by Donald Trump and the Australian government. Australia has been complicit with the US in a major military build-up against China. What are the reasons for this dangerous level of anti-China propaganda by imperialist countries like the US and its allies? Our speakers will start a discussion about these issues. This forum is also a launch of a new pamphlet, Behind the Cold War on China, which is published by Resistance Books. And actually both speakers have participated in authoring new books on China. So 2 speakers tonight. We'll start with Dave Holmes from Socialist Alliance, who's one of the 3 authors of Behind the Cold War on China. And he'll be followed by David Brophy, who's also the author of a new book called China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoia and Pandering. It's just being launched around the country at the moment, I gather. And David Brophy is also historian, senior lecturer in modern Chinese history. So the speakers will speak for around 15 minutes each. Then we'll open the meeting up to questions and discussions. We'll also live stream the event from Facebook, but we'll stop the recording once we start questions and discussion. So firstly, I'd like to call on Dave Holmes to start the discussion, and he'll be followed by David Brophy. Dave? Dave, you're muted. Dave, you're muted. Dave?
Okay, that's it.
Okay, great.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, socialists are not the only ones who talk about a new Cold War between the US and China. It's becoming a commonplace in the mainstream media today. But we have an explanation for it. All the endless propaganda and punitive measures against China are part of a campaign by Western imperialism, principally the United States, to isolate and contain China and reassert Washington's hitherto uncontested hegemony, economically, militarily, and politically. Despite its enormous power, the US is in relative decline. Just compare its position now to that at the end of World War II. Then it was the unchallenged world superpower, the only one. Now China is an emerging superpower. It is challenging the US, both economically and militarily. And the US is beset by truly massive, glaring social problems, obvious to everybody. Over the last 3 decades, China's economy has surged forward. Arguably, China now has the world's biggest economy and is vital to world capitalist economic growth. Per capita GDP remains low, but it's rising. One example says a lot for me, and I cited in our pamphlet. China now has 38,000 kilometres of high-speed rail. Plan to increase this to 70,000 kilometres by 2035. The US has next to nothing in this regard. Well, in response to China's rise, Washington and its Western allies have pushed a raft of economic measures. Huawei has been stopped from bidding on contracts. Chinese companies are not allowed to buy certain assets. Trump imposed a range of tariffs, which Biden has not lifted. Australia brought in an unprecedented foreign influence law. Along with these measures, there has been a non-stop drumbeat of propaganda. The Western campaign against China focuses on three broad themes or areas. Firstly, a fake concern for human rights centered on Hong Kong and the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China. Two, charges against the Chinese government and China-based companies of tech surveillance, spying and industrial espionage. And three, whipping up a fear of Chinese military growth and capabilities. Well, at this point, we have to be clear, I think, on one key point. What is the nature of China in a socio-economic sense? In our view, it is capitalist. The state promotes and defends capitalism. China had a real revolution in 1949. Land reforms were carried out, and by 1956, the capitalist class had been expropriated. But the Mao leadership was always a privileged Stalinist bureaucratic caste, and over the last 30 or so years, it has restored capitalism. And Chris Lee's article in our pamphlet explains this transformation. But having said that, I think we have to recognise that Chinese capitalism has some very distinctive features: the extremely strong centralised state control and the culture of state-owned enterprises. There's some confusion about China on the international left. Some leftists oppose the US Cold War attacks, but to varying degrees, they think that China is socialist or at least non-capitalist, that the hue and cry about Uyghur oppression is just Western propaganda, and downplay or reject claims that China is fundamentally undemocratic and repressive. Well, we can discuss all this, but I think such apologetics just weakens our argument. In fact, the case of China is only one instance of some leftists criticizing authoritarian regimes that come under attack by Washington. Other examples include Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Syria under Assad, or Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Well, the US charges that the huge Chinese tech company Huawei is under the control of the Chinese government, and its technology will be used for spying, or might be used for spying. So we can't use any of their telecommunications equipment, even though it seems that it is the cheapest and best. Trump even wanted to force Chinese divestment of the popular video sharing company TikTok, accusing it of posing serious security and privacy issues to its 80 million US users. However, Biden seems to have let that one slide. But Washington's charges overall are staggeringly hypocritical. I just want to look at one instance. In early June, the G7 summit was held in Carbis Bay on Cornwall's north coast. The leaders of the main imperialist countries had a closed session to discuss what to do about China. The final communique predictably attacked China on the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and the origins of COVID. If the G7 leaders had been so minded, they could have travelled up the corner coast about 100 kilometres as the crow flies to Buda. Now, Buda is the site of a government communications headquarters, GCHQ station, which plays a key role in tapping into transoceanic communications cables. This is the Tempora program first exposed by Edward Snowden in 2013. A Wired report at the time explained, and I'm quoting, interceptors have been placed on around 200 fibre optic cables where they come ashore. This appears to have been done with a secret cooperation, voluntary or forced, of the companies that operate the cables, potentially giving GCHQ access to 10 gigabytes of data a second, or 21 petabytes a day. GCHQ wasn't exaggerating when it used the phrase mastering the internet in documents. Around 300 GCHQ and 250 United States NSA operatives are tasked with sifting through the data. They use specific searches which can relate to trigger words, email addresses of interest or targeted persons, and phone numbers. GCHQ and the NSA have identified 40,000 and 30,000 triggers respectively. This data is shared with the NSA. Another report at the end of quote, another report at the time explained that GCHQ has tapped 200 of the world's fibre optic cables. It is surveilling more than 600 telephone events a day, can intercept emails, check internet users' access of websites, and can see what people are posting on Facebook. So clearly, China has a lot of catching up to do. The West charges really are an extreme case of the pot calling the kettle black. Let's look at another example briefly. Last year, a scandal erupted in Denmark, largely unreported here. The Danish equivalent, or the FE, the Danish equivalent of the CIA, was exposed as having spied on its EU and NATO allies on behalf of Washington. Left-wing Denmark-based journalist Ron Ridenour summed it up in a covert action report, quote, Denmark's military allows the United States National Security Agency to spy on the nation's finance ministry, foreign ministry, private weapons company Terma, the entire Danish population, and Denmark's closest neighbours, Sweden, Norway, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Well, this activity is exactly what the West accuses China of doing. Now let's look briefly at the question of human rights. There's no doubt in my mind that China, among other things, has a repressive authoritarian regime, a dictatorship. It represses the working class and forces them to endure a harsh exploitation, often for the benefit of big Western corporations. It also subjects the non-Han Chinese populations in Tibet and Western China to national oppression. In front of the whole world, it crushed the Hong Kong democracy movement. Whatever the political confusion and mistakes of this movement, calling for Western help, calling for independence and so on, overall it was a very progressive, deeply rooted struggle for democratic rights. And socialists and the left had a duty to support it. But when the West hits China over its repressive policies, it is a bit hard to take it seriously. Just look at the United States. The Black Lives Matter movement shone a searchlight on the nature of US society. There is what has been called a new Jim Crow system based on massive black incarceration and racist killer cop forces across the country. In fact, incarceration in general plays a huge role in the United States. A Wikipedia report explains the facts. Quote, at the end of 2016, the Prison Policy Initiative, a non-profit organisation for decarceration, estimated that in the United States, about 2.25 million people were incarcerated out of a population of 324 million. This means about 0.7% of the population was in prison. Total US incarceration, prisons and jails peaked in 2008, and the total correctional population peaked in 2007. If all prisoners are counted, then in 2008, the United States had around 25% of the world's almost 10 million prisoners. So the US had almost a quarter of the world's prison population. As of 2009, the United States had the highest documented incarceration rate in the world at 7.54 per 100,000. Well, a disproportionate proportion of this prison population is, of course, black and minority. Well, the West makes a lot of propaganda about China's military buildup. A February 26 article by Liu Zhen in Monthly Review explains that the Gulf War was a wake-up call for China's military leaders. The Gulf War, he says, sparked 30 years of chaos and turmoil in the once powerful Middle Eastern country, but also served as a rude awakening for China's military leadership. With the technology and firepower on show during the conflict, precision bombing, satellite guidance, missile interception, air-to-surface strikes to eliminate tanks, electronic warfare, one-way transparency on the battlefield, stealth bombers, the Gulf War was a psychological nuclear attack on China, observers say. The event helped to kickstart China's military modernization and led to the People's Liberation Army narrowing the gap with the US military, so much that it is now considered a strategic threat by Washington. Desert Storm, he says, which lasted 6 weeks, marked the dawn of a warfare revolution, showing backwardness of the PLA at the time and sparked anxiety regarding national security, experts say. Well, that's the reality. China's military revolution and arms build-up, whatever else you can say, is fundamentally a defensive measure against the threat of a US attack. China saw what happened to Iraq and doesn't want the same fate to befall it. Even if China were a vibrant socialist democracy, which is not the case, it would still face the same US war threat and would be forced to develop a countervailing military force strong enough to deter Washington. Okay, well, Donald Trump has gone and Joe Biden has reversed many of his policies, but one area where he hasn't is China. In fact, he's pushed some new initiatives aimed at China. And a May 31 Sydney Morning Herald article by Stephen Bartholomew's, who seems to be specialising in reporting what's going on in China's economy, discussed the situation and this bill, which Biden was pushing, called the United States Innovation and Competition Act. He says, a sprawling $250 billion plus suite of legislation aimed squarely at enhancing America's ability to compete with China, along with a grab bag of other anti-China measures, is winding its way through the US Congress. At the core of the legislation, he says, is spending designed to provide incentives for domestic semiconductor manufacturing and research and development in strategic sectors like artificial intelligence, 5G wireless, quantum computing, biotechnology, and robotics, industries that China has identified as central to its plans for global technology leadership and into which it is pouring state funds. This bill calls for Taiwan's inclusion in international bodies, requires an unclassified report on the origins of the coronavirus, opposes international development banks' assistance to China, provides funding to counter predatory bilateral lending, that is code for China's Belt and Road program, and will impose more sanctions on China for its treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China, etc., etc. All right. And the US military, we might add, continues to guzzle an enormous amount of funds each year. It is renewing nuclear arsenal at great cost and continues to push allies like Japan to shoulder more of the burden of building a military force to counter China. Of course, just as in the long Cold War with the Soviet Union, everything is presented as the US responding to threats from China. In my opinion, the opposite is true. US bases surround China like a noose, and the US has a humongous nuclear arsenal and is the only country which has ever used nuclear weapons in war, and it still refuses to make a no first strike pledge, no nuclear first strike pledge. The US routinely interferes in the affairs of other countries and organises destabilisation campaigns and coups. Washington is the aggressor and wants to maintain its edge. China is right to be concerned. Well, I'm sure David Brophy will have a lot to say about the China panic in Australia. And our pamphlet also refutes a lot of the hysterical claims about Chinese influence in Australia. So I'll be brief. I wouldn't dispute that China is active in the Chinese community here, or that it surveils Chinese students in Australia, or that it tries to cultivate political figures. However, the US influence in this regard is qualitatively greater than China's. We can assume it has agents, contacts, and informants everywhere, in Parliament, in academia, in the community, and in the trade unions. I hope people read Jeff Sparrow's recent Guardian piece on Bob Hawke. When he was simply a great trade union leader in the 1970s, Hawke was in regular contact with the US Embassy. He said one thing in public and another to his US friends. If Hawke were around today, he might well have fallen foul of the new foreign influence laws. After all, he was an unregistered foreign agent. Well, China's economic influence, I think, has been massively hyped. It is much less than that of the US. At the end of 2019, the US and the United Kingdom together accounted for 43% of foreign investment in Australia. China accounted for 5.7%. And all the restrictions will continue to keep China's share low. In some quarters, for instance, China was being blamed for the housing crisis. Again, this is utter rubbish. The housing crisis in Australia is the result of capitalist speculation, tax laws which facilitate this, and above all, the absolute refusal of state and federal governments to build quality public housing on any serious scale. Chinese investment plays an absolutely minuscule part in all of this. Okay, well, in conclusion, how should the left and the progressive movement respond to all this? I want to suggest 4 key areas for propaganda and campaigns. Firstly, left and progressive forces must campaign against any war with China. Secondly, Australia must break with the US war alliance. That is, withdraw from ANZUS, the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group, and the Quad, and anything else of that kind. Close down the US bases on Australian soil, especially Pine Gap, and anything else used in nuclear warfighting. 3, our military should be reconfigured for strictly local, genuinely defensive activities. Scrap the frightfully expensive weapons programs, the planes, the submarines, and the missiles, which are designed to fit into the US regional war effort and which have nothing to do with the actual defence of Australia against actual threats. Use the money instead for useful programs, the transition to renewables, public housing, healthcare, and public education. Fourthly, we want to see the main elements, the commanding heights of the economy in public hands. Nationalise key sectors of the economy, first and foremost the banks, the mining sector, and the power industry, under real democratic control. Then we would prohibit, or we should prohibit, any foreign company owning anything. If a foreign company wants to invest here, it should be a joint venture with the state under strict conditions, profit sharing, workers' conditions, environmental safeguards, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dave. Now, for people who've just joined the meeting while Dave was speaking, the speaker we just heard from is Dave Holmes from Socialist Alliance, one of the 3 authors of the new pamphlet Behind the Cold War on China. And we're just about to hear from David Brophy, who's a historian and senior lecturer in modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney. He's also the author of a brand new book, which is in the process of being launched around the country, called China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoia and Pandering. Thanks, David. All yours.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm coming to you from Bidjigal land in Sydney, and I want to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the elders of that community. First of all, congratulations on getting the pamphlet out. I imagine if we sat down and we thrashed everything out, we might eventually find some points of nuance and emphasis on which we disagree. But I basically go along with what Dave has outlined in his introduction. So I'm not going to rehearse all the points that I make in my book, China Panic, just to give you a sort of rough idea of the perspective. My starting point is that Australia is not simply a US lapdog here, nor is it, of course, an innocent victim of Chinese imperialism. It's playing itself an active role in stoking hostilities for what it identifies as its own interests, which include, but are not limited to, its proprietary claim to its own chunk of the region in the Pacific. We've just come out of 2 decades of the war on terror, and China is now becoming the motivating principle of Australian militarism and is replacing terrorism as the justification for an ongoing attack on civil liberties. And this is being fueled by all sorts of grossly exaggerated claims, which is what specifically I'm referring to when I talk about China Panic. I might just give you a quote from someone to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. I opened the book with this quote from the the woman who was Australia's top diplomat last year, Frances Adamson, she's talking about Chinese subversion of Australia. The institutions that we take for granted, our parliament, our democracy, our legal system, our freedom of speech and association, they really are at stake now. And there's really, there's more than an echo here of this early 2000s. They hate us for our freedoms. They're coming to take our freedoms in the type of language that people, and this is not someone from the security agencies. This is someone from DFAT talking in this way. Obviously, a very predictable consequence of all this has been a spike in anti-Chinese racism, both at the street level and in the more sophisticated Australian values, exclusionary rhetoric. We still have people, very mainstream voices out there calling for cuts to Chinese immigration. We have to be conscious of how this is becoming normalized. Peter Hartcher has a book out in which he makes that call very explicitly. That book was launched by Penny Wong in Canberra a couple of months ago. So the ALP is willing to side with publications that explicitly call for cuts to migration from China. My book offers some recent history as to how we got to this point, going back in time, but then honing in from 2017 onwards. I talk about how things are playing out at universities. I also offer my take on questions like Xinjiang and Hong Kong from a standpoint of defense of national and democratic rights in China. And I'm happy to go into detail on any specific issue people in the audience might want to discuss. But I'm just going to generally reflect for the rest of my talk on where things stand today and what we need to be doing. Now, the fact that I was able to publish this book and get a hearing for it, I think does reflect a feature of the situation, which is a sense of discomfort out there as to where things are going in Australia's relationship with China. As Dave pointed out, we're far from the only people to be talking about the possibility of a new Cold War, or maybe the reality of a new Cold War. It reflects the fact that, unlike certain other issues that the left engages in, the shape of the elite debate does create a certain space for progressive critique. I mean, there are dovish voices from the security world, for example, who think that, well, Australia's strategy of dependence on the US is simply not going to work. It's past its use-by date, and there needs to be an alternative. At the same time, I'm certainly not optimistic that it's going to be easy to open up this debate at the political level, let alone shift Australia's basic posture. Just a week after the book was finalized, that was the moment where we had the drums of war speeches from politicians and bureaucrats. Clearly an intention to shift the discussion in a more militaristic direction, and that is unfortunately occurring. If you look at the polls, the last one to come out indicated that around about 40% of Australians think that China might one day militarily attack Australia. This is the terrain on which we are having to operate. Obviously, there are the deep cultural reserves of hostility to China and Chinese people that are being tapped into. I think a fairly widely held view that in relation to China, when you boil it down, we are the good guys, they are the bad guys. At the end of the day, it's preferable for Australians to live in a US-centric world than a Sino-centric world. I mean, these are quite widely held assumptions. These are habits of mind that we're up against and are going to make the task of the left difficult in the coming period. Now, a certain amount of balance, I think, is necessary when we're talking about war. We have to explain to people what a disastrous thing that would be. I think people are too blasé about that often. We also have to recognize that talking up the horrors of war can itself contribute to this climate of panic. This is a strategic question that I've had to grapple with as I've been drawn into doing more tabloid-style publicity for this book. So we have to state very strongly that under no circumstances should we support Australian involvement in a war with China. At the same time, we have to debunk some of the claims that are being put forward to scare people that this is a question immediately confronting us, that China is coming to enslave our grandchildren, that it's on the verge of invading Taiwan, and that the dominoes in Asia will fall after that. We do need to find ways to get through to people out there who are worried about China. We don't need to persuade people who already think that the situation is all the fault of the US. And as I say, I don't see this as an easy task. We have to give people a characterization, a realistic picture of what Australia is and what China is and where it's going. Yes, China does domestically see liberal democracy as an enemy. It's not something that the party is willing to tolerate domestically within China, but that does not entail that China has any interest, for example, in the way that Australia governs itself. China is not functioning with an ideology of manifest destiny. We're not in the 19th century where powers are simply in a position to divide up the globe into spheres of influence. At the same time, of course, the dynamics of Chinese economic growth are pushing it outwards. We know that it has ambitions to revise the security setup in Asia, which was put in place when China was on its knees politically and economically in the 1950s, that it wants to resolve the Taiwan question ultimately in its favor, and that it wants to deter the US militarily. Now, I think the case can be made, as Dave did, that this is primarily a defensive reaction to this sense of containment and the American military presence. But of course, in the eyes of China's neighbors, this is self-aggrandizing, aggressive behavior. Passing out exactly what is offensive and defensive in this kind of situation, I think, is not necessarily easy or worthwhile. So, the task here is not to prettify what China is and what its ambitions might lead it to become. It has to be balanced by a realistic picture of what Australia and the US is. And it is the case, as Dave said, that the accusations being thrown around often represent more than a degree of projection. Australia and the US are the ones militarizing the Pacific, for example, with a new base they're pushing for in the PNG, not China, despite the screaming headlines of China moving in on the Pacific militarily. We are the ones who have spent the last 2 decades bombing and killing to reshape the politics of the Middle East. If you want to talk about foreign interference, there's a pretty good example. But the key point here, I think, is trying to provide people with a systemic critique, not to convince people that, it's not China that's the problem, it's the US that's the problem. But it's the rivalry here that is the problem. And to win people to the view that China's rise is not something unique, but is conditioned by its history as a victim of imperialism and the nature of interstate competition in this capitalist world. And this goes to the point about rules, which is a term that is often thrown around in quite a propagandistic way, that China is breaking the rules or it's challenging the rules-based international order. We need to be clear. The rules, China is not going to interpret the rules. It's not going to be dictated to as to what the rules of the system are. It's going to extrapolate the rules from the way the system actually works. And it's going to look at America as a country that has declared hegemony across an entire hemispheres, that has always always carried itself above any notion of international law. And China may eventually decide, well, if it wants a piece of that too. What we should be worried about really is that China will play by the rules, not that China will break the rules. And this kind of perspective obviously applies domestically too. Yes, we need to criticize the alarmism in the reporting towards China, while at the same time trying to reframe the critiques that are made of China's activities in Australia, where there is substance to them, as reflective of flaws in the political system here, not as something specific to China. So there's no need to deny that there are people with pro-PRC proclivities active in Australia, and so on. What we should not do is remove these facts from a wider context in which all sorts of lobbies are active. And many of them much more effective than China's. I would argue this all requires democratic solutions that enhance the integrity and transparency of the system. Unfortunately, we have a crop of politicians who are simply unwilling to do that. So the measures that they've taken have actually really done nothing to remove the sort of money and donations that slosh around in Australian politics, but they've done a lot to stigmatize Chinese Australians as a fifth column and empower the security agencies to go after them. And this is, I think, just one facet of the emptying out of this concept of democracy from much actual substantive content, the way so that it gets thrown around as this tool of sloganeering. It's actually quite a popular argument, for example, out there now. If you read what Biden's people, for example, write, that the state of democracy around the world, the cause of democracy, is dependent on the constitutions of the most powerful countries in the world, right? So if America has elections, if America is top dog, then democracy is going to be on an upward trajectory. If it is replaced by China, then it will be on a downward trajectory. Now, there's obviously no reason to be confident that, China's growing influence will be necessarily good for democracy. But our point obviously has to be that the state of something like democracy in Australia is not dependent on the outcome of a rivalry for dominance in Asia, but on the mobilization of ordinary people to uphold and enhance, the democratic elements that do exist in our system through participation. And the course of confrontation now is endangering those elements, it has to be said. Foreign policy is always something that's quite removed from popular participation or oversight, particularly the case when it involves the US. We need to be telling people the truth here, that the presence of American facilities on Australian soil means that the most basic question in this whole discussion, whether or not Australia goes to war, may ultimately be decided by people elsewhere. And of course, the proposals that are being introduced to, shore up Australian democracy against China, I mean, these are only continuing this downward trajectory. I mentioned Hartship before. He talks in his book about the need to introduce security checks for Australian citizens running for office. So that is a democratic right that we have in Australia right now, that anyone who is an Australian citizen can run for office. He wants to take away that democratic right and make it conditional on, security agencies giving the thumbs up. So that objectively removing democratic rights from Australians. How am I doing for time? I've got...
You've probably got about 3 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. I'll try and wrap up soon. Okay. I could say a little bit more about, I mentioned at the top sort of elite constituencies for an alternative line on China. We need to be aware of those viewpoints and have a critique. I think, so a lot of this is people are sort of putting forward a strategy that I see as basically passé, this idea that Australia could just go back to being friends with China and the US at the same time, or things that are just not very attractive from a progressive viewpoint, the sort of Fortress Australia, that Australia will go it alone without the US, but to do so will double military spending, become a more militaristic country. Just one point about strange bedfellows. I think it would be a mistake. It is the case, obviously, that confrontation with China is costing Australia's exports. I think it would be a mistake for the left to base too much of its rhetoric on that point, and we don't need to. Obviously, we shouldn't be blasé about the consequences that this policy turn may have for people, but we don't put the trade imperative above all else. There may be good reasons for Australia to blow up trade with China. The point is simply that Australia has not done so for good reasons. The left intervention, I think, has to say, well, regardless of what China thinks of Australia, the course that we're on right now is bad for Australia. It's making us less safe, it's endangering civil liberties, and it's stoking racism. So the left position can't obviously simply be to advocate for a return to some sort of corporate-led engagement paradigm, were such a thing even possible. For all the hyperbole and exaggeration, the situation has revealed certain truths about Australia. The business elites often have too much say in foreign policy, that they've been too cozy with China at certain times. I mean, the left has said that. We need to keep saying that. Obviously, the situation has also revealed truths about China that we should not shy away from. The repression in Xinjiang is not made up. It's very serious and ongoing. Situation in Hong Kong represents a setback for the cause of democracy. Globally, Taiwan is in a precarious position. We have to be conscious of all these things as we go forward. But none of these things can justify the current antagonistic posture that Australia has taken, or certainly any Australian involvement in a future war with China. Basically, that's it. It's never too early to start rebuilding the anti-war movement. We're not getting any clarity from politicians on this, so more Australians do need to stand up and register their dissent with what is a reckless and dangerous course of action. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks very much, David. Now we're going to open up to questions and discussion, but first of all, I just...
Thanks for joining us on this live stream. We're going to finish up the discussion here. If you're watching right now, you can tune into the Zoom forum, which the link is in the video description. And please, once again, if you like the work that we do, please become a Green Left supporter. The link is in the description below.